Hello, everybody, and welcome to this talk. I'll just share my screen while I'm introducing myself. I'm at the University of Aberdeen and sharing my research into the James Madison Carpenter collection, building actually on some work I did in the 1990s, but since then I've done a lot more work on the collection. It's been digitised and we've catalogued it. I'm part of a research team that works on the collection and is hoping eventually to produce a critical edition. So I hope you can hear me okay. And this is a bit of a whirlwind tour, but looking at Carpenter and trying to evaluate him a little bit as both a recordist and a transcriber of traditional song, particularly in Britain, actually less so the American recordings. So I was hoping to show you a film, but unfortunately time is against me, so I'm not able to do that. I've had to cut down the talk quite a lot. So instead, I'm just putting the URL there. It's part of the University of Aberdeen Elphinstone Institute channel on YouTube. And sorry, you can't see that there. So that is the place to have a look at that film if you'd like to see an introductory film about the collection. We will just meanwhile recap a little bit on who Carpenter was and how his collection came to be. So Carpenter, very much someone who was in Britain in the 1930s, basically 1928, and then again in 1929 to 35. He was American and had been studying at Harvard, just finished a PhD in sea shanties when he first came over, or was working on his PhD rather, and then finished it and came back to Britain to do more collecting. So he's very much in the interwar period. He was quite distinct from his predecessor folk song collectors in that he wasn't from Britain, he wasn't a native of the country, and that he was academically trained. He was in fact a literary scholar at Harvard, learning with Professor George Lyman Kittredge, no less, who was a very renowned Shakespeare scholar and the student of Francis James Child, whose collection of ballads had been a very important turning point in the history of ballad scholarship in the late 19th century. Carpenter was also funded. He had money from Harvard to do the collecting, and he had a car that enabled him to drive around. So his geographical scope was much greater than some of his predecessors. And he covered a lot of, particularly England and Scotland, parts of Wales, and also had one foray to Dublin. As you can see here, his extension is extremely extensive. That's the kind of content that you would find, the kind of formats within the collection. These are song texts, very largely from Scotland, but not exclusively, quite a few from England as well, a few from America. Play texts, mummers' plays, folk plays, about 300 of those, music notations, and so on and so forth, but particularly these sound recordings. So here we have 100 dictaphone cylinders. The discs were copies of those cylinders that he made later on. So the basic sound recording is these dictaphone cylinders. We think there's about 35 hours worth of recording there, possibly about 300 items recorded there. And the slide shows you the sort of genres that are covered by these. He was in some ways able to record more widely, perhaps, than some of his other predecessors. But on the other hand, we know he was still very selective in what he chose to record, and in very much betrays his background in terms of his literary approach to song. So we know from the work of Andrew King on early Folk Song Society recordings, others speaking at this conference as well, and indeed other publications, that of course Carpenter was by no means the first person to use the sound recording equipment in collecting. He had been, he was though, very much, as I said, the person who perhaps used it the most widely in the country in that interwar period when there was relatively little other collecting going on in this country. And he recorded quite a diversity of song types. His collection is also significant because it contains rare and unique examples, particularly of ballads of the Child canon, Francis James Child canon of folk ballads. And It's interesting also that Carpenter was collecting in the sort of early 1930s, which was the same time as the English Folk Dance Society and the Folk Song Society's amalgamation into the English Folk Dance and Song Society, when they noted that, in fact, they thought most of the collecting had now been done. And then Carpenter came along. He didn't have any contact with them. He really was quite an independent soul, and he ended up recording a great deal more material, variants certainly of what had been collected before, but obviously new people, new performers, and new songs as well. Another very important thing is that he was recording from the last generation of sailors who had shipped in the time of commercial square-rigged sail, so who had actually sung sea shanties as part of their job. So the collection is important, but it didn't have much of an impact until recently because, of course, it was squirreled away with Carpenter in America and was only deposited with the Library of Congress towards the end of Carpenter's life in 1972. It was never been published until it was digitized and has now become available online. I've been working with a team of scholars to produce our transcriptions of it and indeed a critical edition. So Carpenter's collection with the dictaphone is remarkable, really, given his literary background. He wasn't coming from a music department, but he was encouraged from the very start to use the dictaphone by his tutor, Kittredge, who I mentioned already, absolutely no experience of fieldwork himself, but who got the funding for Carpenter to buy some recording equipment. And this is what Carpenter bought, a dictaphone cylinder machine. In a later interview, he said that it was brand new, but this wasn't actually true. As many of you here at the conference will know, the dictaphone was developed in the late 19th century by Alexander Graham Bell, and was promoted for use in office as a part of office equipment in the early 20th century, when it was described as the greatest business invention of the age. And Carpenter himself had a 6-volt battery version, and he seems to have used it to record the melodies of the songs he was collecting. He used it in conjunction with a portable typewriter on which he typed the text of singers' dictation, so they were reciting it 2 lines at a time, and then he'd type up the words of the full song. So what's important to realise about Carpenter's recordings is that they're not complete, and that he ended up actually documenting the text of the song and a few verses, sometimes one, sometimes up to half a dozen of them, from the singers, merely to obtain the music. And it seems as though the recording isn't really the primary document, just as it isn't with dictation, the office use. It was just a means to an end, and then the whole thing would be transcribed, and that would become the primary document. However, he did use it, and he used it well. He found that singers were quite excited, and he says they were all needles and pins when it came to recording, and they often pitched their songs quite high. So he would let them repeat the verses until they settled down into a pitch that was useful for them to sing in and comfortable. He initially shaved some of his cylinders from his 1928 summer expedition, but after that he was able to afford to keep them and buy more. He did, however, sometimes economise by squeezing lots of recordings onto the one cylinder. So this cylinder, I think the dictaphone cylinder holds about 10 minutes worth at the recommended speed, but Carpenter here used it and managed to get 15 minutes worth of material on it, which he says is, I think it says 37 ballads on the one record. So obviously this was at the expense of quality. So let's have a look at the transcriptions that he made of his cylinder recordings. He didn't transcribe them all. He in fact focused on the ones, or they evidence his particular priorities. First of all, this was the shanties. This wasn't for his thesis, which contains completely the lyrics of the songs, but he must have had a publication, I think, of the collection eventually in mind, so he transcribed the music of the shanties initially. His plan was, though, not to transcribe it, but to give it to somebody else to transcribe, and this is because Carpenter was not a trained musician. He had no background in music. And he talks in the later interview, when he deposited his collection with the Library of Congress, describing how he approached in 1928 a famous musician in Bristol to transcribe the tunes from his recordings. He says, "When this musician heard my dictaphone with the nasal twang of the horn, he said, 'Why, I don't hear any tune.'" He approached another man who did the transcriptions of a few tunes, but in Carpenter's view, it was very disappointing. He said he couldn't do a thing with it, or that is, he'd just write the notes, but if there was any grace note or any slur, he'd just ironed out square and put this note one after another. So this seems to bespeak an attitude on Carpenter's part of an interest in style, of performance, and in detail. How did he get on when he was just self-taught? Let's have a look at one of the examples. So this is a shanty that was recorded, as you see, from Ruth Baldwin in Barry Docks in South Wales. Baldwin first shipped on board a sailboat in 1879 and last sailed in 1908. So he hadn't sung these on board a ship for 20 years. Pull Down Below is just one of the shanties that he recorded for Carpenter, but what's special about it is that, in fact, this seems to be the only recording that's ever been made of this song. It's the only evidence that we have of it. This transcription, we think, comes from about 1928, and you can see how rough it is on the left-hand side there. I don't find it particularly easy to read, especially the notes on the ledger lines. It's okay once we get into the stave. I just want to just exit the PowerPoint and play you a feed. I've just put this into Finale, and which I've now exited. Let's quickly go into Finale and get that out again. And we can hear what Carpenter's transcription sounds like. And then I will play you the recording so you can compare, see how he got on. So here we go. This is what he transcribed. Back into the PowerPoint and now have a listen, if you can, with the other transcription that I just played side by side. Because of time, I'm not going to play the full transcription, but I hope you can see there's quite a few anomalies here. First of all, Carpenter's obviously struggling to get the real pitch of these particular notes, the low notes. He's better when on the Pull Down Below chorus there. And you can see by the end of the first verse there, he's actually got a tonal center of D, but by the end of the whole thing, he's got a tonal center of C, although in fact the pitch doesn't change in the rendition. You may also have noticed that when the singer got to the end of the first verse, he repeats the first verse and then goes into the chorus, but this isn't actually documented in Carpenter's version. So there's a number of things, also rhythmic things. It's very four square, and maybe doesn't pick up any of the rhythmic nuances. I've had to go at this myself, so we'll just compare. You can judge for yourself whether you think I've actually picked this up any better than Carpenter did. Okay, so I certainly am not going to pretend that that's perfect, but I've tried very hard to pick up a little bit of the rhythmic nuances as well, and to also more truly represent that variable third in the transcription. Okay. However, Carpenter wasn't deterred. He came back from the United Kingdom in 1935 and set about, with a bit of funding again, transcribing his ballads, and began to really develop an appreciation of the fact that, of course, the affordances of a recording are that you can play it over and over again, so you get more chance to get it correct. And he says, as you'll see here from the quotation, that transcriptions can be checked by many people, and that this is a much more preferable way of being able to notate tunes rather than by ear in the field. So he was kind of being converted to it. It was only, unfortunately, about 1938, when he began to look for other work, when his funding ran out for the transcription work, that he got in touch with John Lomax. He was away, so Alan Lomax at the Library of Congress answered Carpenter's letter, and it was Alan Lomax who said, you really need to be making copies of these recordings so you don't wear out the cylinders with all the transcription work you're doing. Carpenter did then transfer them, as we've seen, to lacquer discs, but unfortunately some of the damage had been done, and I think the quality has suffered of the recordings, of the cylinder recordings, consequently. Anyway, he was working on transcription at this time, and as I said, proclaiming the advantages of it. He found, nevertheless, that the work was extremely laborious, and this is where the title of the paper comes from. I wrestle with the tunes, and then I go out and exercise, he says, and tackle the work the next morning again. He says, a wrestler with sounds is a wrestler with shadows. They are here, they are gone, they are impalpable as a morning gossamer, yet they rack the pursuer like ancient instruments of torture. Okay, so you can get a sense of a slightly flowery literary style that he had. There's a little bit of hyperbole there, but anyone who's done any detailed transcription knows just how frustrating and laborious a task it can be, especially with recordings that are not always particularly clear. So I think we can identify with Carpenter a little bit there. His exact method was to memorize tunes from the recording so he could sing them exactly the way that the singer did. Then he would stop the recording and he would work out the notation by, as he said, gripping the tune and remembering the scale at the same time and holding the notes against the scale that was in my mind. Then he played the recording to check to see that he had it right. It doesn't seem, though, that he actually checked the transcription on an independent fixed pitch instrument. So that may be where some of his inaccuracies come in. So let's see how he went on with the ballad transcriptions as distinct from his earlier ones from the of the shanties. So this is one a ballad of the child canon that he collected from William Titchener in Berkshire, as you can see. Titchener learnt this song from singers in the village. It was one of several that he sang, he, in fact, Carpenter recorded 3 renditions. They follow on one from another on the same cylinder. Each one of those renditions has 3 stanzas in it. So there are 9 stanzas in all, 3 renditions of 3 stanzas each. Interestingly, they're not identical, not just in terms of the tunes, but also in terms of the words. I don't know if you know the story of this ballad. It's better known perhaps as The Maid Freed from the Gallows. In this case, though, the protagonist is a male, not a maid. And in the song, the protagonist addresses the hangman, the ragaman jagaman in this version, to stay execution. They are a condemned prisoner and they're asking the hangman to stay execution because they can see a family member coming along the horizon with some money to set them free. Each member of the family tends to say no, and then the lover comes and the lover brings the money and the prisoner is set free. In this first verse, which you can see here in a rough version by Carpenter, it's interesting to see that it is the father who is first summoned, and he says, "No, I don't have the money," which is sort of the usual pattern. However, the second rendition, the singer changes this. And so we have exactly the same verses, but the father says he has brought the money to set the prisoner free. In the third rendition, we have the lover coming, but the lover says, no, I'm not going to set you free, and I haven't brought the money. And then we have a verse about the briar, the prickly briar, which is a kind of chorus for all the versions. So there seems to be some confusion as to the story of the ballad, and that's unusual. And I just wonder if it stems from the recording technique itself. The singer, maybe having been stopped after the second verse on the first rendition, thought this doesn't work as a story, so I'll make the father bring the money in my second rendition, so the story is complete with the protagonist being set free. And then Carpenter recorded them again, so they bring in the lover, but the lover then says, no, I haven't brought the money, because of course that's already happened in the second rendition where the father's brought the money. Excuse me. So it does seem as though there might have been some confusion on the part of the singer there, as a result of the recording technique. As you can see, Carpenter says here, beginning plus variation. He was interested in the melodic variation, and there's certainly some of that. And unusually, or not, uncharacteristic of the shanties, but very characteristic of the ballad transcriptions, is we have a fair copy as well. And in this, you can see a lot more detail. Carpenter's able to bring in extended bars. So we see the 9/8 bars. We have a proper time signature now. Over here, we have some of the notation, some rather more sophisticated and experimental rhythmic notation. And I'm not quite sure how, because there's no pitch pipe or independent speed setter at the beginning of any of these recordings, but Carpenter has very confidently given a metronome marking as well. Carpenter transcribes all the renditions as separate transcriptions there. So there's an interest in melodic variation and detail. However, I would say that some of the notes still aren't entirely accurate. My final example is another child ballad, this time from Scotland, and sung by Carpenter's, I suppose it's his star singer, if you like. He was very proud of having met her and as it were, discovered her in a way that we might be critical of nowadays. But he discovered Belle Duncan in Aberdeenshire in Scotland, very much a singer in a domestic context. No one had found her, as it were, before, or collected from her before. And she had a repertoire of about 300 songs, which she was still very fluent in, many of which were child ballads and included quite rare items such as the White Fisher. And Carpenter recorded her. And this is, in fact, one of the very few recordings of a melody for this particular ballad. He recorded 2 renditions, each of 2 stanzas. Again, there are subtle differences between them. This has been typeset, but you can see this is the first rendition and this is the second one, and the second one begins with an upbeat, the first one doesn't. And there are subtle differences in the text as well. So in the end, the second verse of this one, it says, is it to ain or your father's men? And down here, it's, is it to ain or your father's merry men? What's really interesting is that the first rendition of this second verse ends just at the end of the line, at the end of the phrase, I'm sure ye may tell me. In the second rendition, however, you have, I'm sure ye may tell me, dear love, I'm sure ye may tell me. I'll just play a little bit of that in a moment so you can hear that. Oh, sorry, actually I won't be able to, because the whole point of saying about this is that the recording breaks off after the word love, and it then segues very quickly into another song. So in fact, off again. So in fact, this is the only documentation of that slightly extended second stanza. So the transcription is really important here. What's interesting is we can see here Carpenter very much sort of still trying to find a more varied rhythmic style so he can document that more accurately. Again, we've got bars of different time values, and he's got some ornamentation coming in as well. To my ear, he doesn't quite capture it all, but he's definitely trying. He was also very keen on the tonality of the songs and never fails to point out, it seems, whether when they're in one of the modes, particularly the Aeolian or the Dorian mode. In this song, however, he's overlooked the fact, and I think it's pretty clear when you hear the recording, that this has a C sharp in it, as it would be for his transcription anyway, and this isn't there. So if I'll just now play it to you so that you can hear that. We'll just wind it back to the beginning. I hope that was enough to convince you that that might be a C sharp, and it's a fairly stable note all the way through. What's interesting is that now the Carpenter collection has been digitized and is available, is that people have learned the song from this transcription, so are singing it in Carpenter's version rather than Bell Duncan's in terms of the C. However, I suppose that we know very well that songs can be very variable in their tonality, and that indeed it could still be learnt with the C sharp as well and sung that way. So I think it's not too disastrous a change there. I just want to conclude really with a few observations on this. I'd like to say that Carpenter definitely started off using the dictaphone as an aid to transcription, but en route seems to have come round to the realization of its importance as a mode of preservation and for the affordances of sound recording for the more detailed and accurate transcription. He later says, the transcription of from 2 to 6 stanzas with words reveals in many cases amazing adaptations of tune to the emotional context of the verse. So he's beginning to become more interested in the singers. The medium is making him interested, and the process of transcription. And in that sense, it's a kind of process of analysis as well as we know, close listening. Nevertheless, his interests still lay primarily in texts. And I do have to point out that I think the accuracy of his transcriptions is occasionally suspect. Nevertheless, the fact that the sound recordings are preserved means that they have that potential for further study of performance style. And I think you'll agree that there is enough, sort of signal to noise ratio there that we can actually hear enough to make some recording transcriptions of recordings. Just thinking, though, of one other affordance which Carpenter perhaps didn't foresee, but which has come out of this, and that is that the future use of the recordings by the descendants of the singers has become something we've been able to make happen, and others before us. So here we have Rhys Baldwin, who sang us Pull Down Below earlier on. He was dead by the time that people became aware of Carpenter's collection, but people have visited his daughter, who actually was about 16 or 17 when Carpenter visited and remembered Carpenter's visit. And she, was moved to tears when she heard those recordings of her father. Not only that, but as you see on the slide there, the family have made recordings and put them onto YouTube of the family photographs combined with Carpenter's recordings, so that they celebrate the recording of the singing of their ancestor. So the recordings are, I think, a source of pride for the families, as well as potential for the future study of folk song. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop there, and we hopefully have time for some questions.